The rain hit the glass doors of the Marsh Grand Hotel so hard that it sounded like small stones thrown by an angry hand. Inside the lobby, a woman in a plain gray coat stood at the front desk, water dripping from her hair onto the marble floor. She had been standing there for almost 10 minutes, and no one had helped her. "Excuse me," she said again, her voice calm but firm. "I have a reservation. The name is Marsh." The young man behind the desk did not even look up from his screen. His name tag read Daniel Price, front desk manager. He tapped his pen against the counter, sighed loudly, and finally raised his eyes to study her. He saw a woman with tired eyes, a coat that looked cheap and wet, and a small bag that had seen better days. He decided, in that one glance, that she did not belong in his hotel. "I don't see any reservation under that name," Daniel said, his tone sharp. "Maybe you should try a different hotel. This one is quite expensive." The woman's jaw tightened, but her voice remained steady. "Please check again. I booked this room myself, 3 days ago." Daniel clicked his mouse a few times, not really searching, just pretending to look busy. Behind the woman, a small line of guests had started to form, and a few of them were watching the exchange with growing discomfort. A well-dressed couple exchanged a glance. An older man cleared his throat, as if to remind Daniel that other people were waiting too. "Ma'am, I really don't have time for this," Daniel said, his patience visibly running out. "If you don't have a real reservation, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside so I can help the other guests." The woman did not move. She placed both hands on the counter and looked directly into his eyes. "I would like you to look again, carefully." Daniel let out a short, mocking laugh. "Look, I don't know what kind of joke this is, but I am the manager here, and I am telling you there is no room booked under your name. If you have a problem with that, you can go complain to the owner. Good luck finding her, though. She never comes here." A small, unreadable smile crossed the woman's face. It was gone, as quickly as it appeared. "The owner," she repeated softly. "Interesting that you mention her." "Yes, the owner," Daniel said, raising his voice slightly, enjoying the small performance he was putting on for the guests behind her. "Elena Marsh. She built this place from nothing, or so the story goes. But she is not here to save you today. So please, step aside." The woman's eyes flickered for just a moment, something sharp and private passing behind them, but her face remained calm. She picked up her wet bag from the floor and stepped back from the counter, allowing the next guest to move forward. She did not argue further. She did not raise her voice. She simply turned and walked toward one of the lobby's leather chairs and sat down, watching everything with quiet, careful eyes. From where she sat, she could see the entire lobby. She could see how a young couple was kept waiting for 20 minutes without a single apology. She could see how an elderly woman was spoken to as if she were a burden rather than a guest. She could see how the doorman ignored a family struggling with heavy suitcases in the rain, while he stood under the shelter, scrolling on his phone. None of it seemed to surprise her, though every small moment made something inside her chest grow tighter and colder. A young woman with a small silver name tag that read Grace Bennett approached carrying a tray of tea. She was one of the newer staff members, still eager, still kind, in a way that had not yet been worn down by the culture around her. She noticed the wet woman sitting alone in the corner and walked over. "Excuse me," Grace said gently. "You look cold. Would you like a cup of tea while you wait?" The woman looked up, surprised by the small kindness. "Thank you," she said. "That's very thoughtful of you." Grace poured the tea and handed it over carefully. "I'm sorry about the wait. It's been a busy night." She hesitated, then added quietly, "Was there a problem with your booking?" "Something like that," the woman replied, wrapping both hands around the warm cup. "The manager says there is no reservation under my name." Grace's brow furrowed slightly. "That's strange. We rarely lose bookings. Let me see if I can help." She turned to walk toward the desk, but before she could take a step, a loud voice rang out from across the lobby. "Grace, I need you at the concierge desk, now. Stop wasting time chatting with guests who aren't even paying customers." It was Daniel, calling out without any attempt at discretion. Several guests turned to look, and Grace's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. She gave the woman an apologetic look. "I'm sorry, I have to go. I hope it gets sorted out." The woman nodded, watching Grace hurry away. She sipped her tea slowly, her eyes drifting toward the tall glass windows where the storm outside seemed to be growing worse. Thunder rumbled somewhere far away, and the lights in the lobby flickered for a brief second before steadying again. She thought about how strange it was, sitting in the very building she had built with her own hands, being treated like a stranger who did not belong. She thought about the years of work, the risks, the nights she had spent worrying about payroll and permits and construction delays, all so that a place like this could exist. And now, a young manager who had worked here for less than 2 years was telling paying guests to go complain to an owner he assumed they would never actually meet. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone, opening a message thread with a name saved simply as Henry. She typed quickly, "I'm at the hotel. Something is very wrong here. Stay close, but don't come in yet. I want to see how far this goes." A reply came back within seconds. "Understood. I'm parked outside, 2 minutes away. Say the word." She slipped the phone back into her bag and continued watching the lobby, sipping her tea, waiting. She was in no hurry. She had built her entire career on patience, on watching quietly before she made her move. And this moment, however uncomfortable, was no different. 10 minutes later, the same elderly woman she had noticed earlier approached the front desk again, holding a small folder of papers. Her voice was polite but clearly frustrated. "Excuse me, sir. I was told my room would be ready an hour ago. I have already paid, and I have my confirmation right here." Daniel barely glanced at the folder. "We've had some system issues tonight. You'll have to wait like everyone else." "I understand there are issues," the elderly woman said, her voice trembling slightly with tiredness. "But I've been traveling for 12 hours, and I was told this hotel prides itself on excellent service." Daniel rolled his eyes, not even trying to hide it. "Ma'am, everyone here is tired. If you don't want to wait, there's a motel 2 streets down. I hear they have vacancies." A gasp rippled through the small group of guests still standing nearby. The woman in the gray coat, still seated in the corner, felt her hands tighten slightly around her teacup. She watched the elderly guest's face fall, watched her shoulders sink with quiet defeat as she turned away from the desk, clutching her folder to her chest. It was in that moment that something shifted inside the woman in gray. She had been willing to wait, willing to watch a little longer, but there were limits to patience, and Daniel Price was quickly testing them. She stood, smoothed the front of her damp coat, and walked calmly toward the front desk once more. Daniel noticed her approaching and let out an exaggerated sigh. "Back again. I told you, there's no reservation under your name. I heard you the first time," she said evenly. "I'd like to speak to whoever is in charge tonight. Not you. Someone above you." Daniel crossed his arms, a smug smile forming on his lips. "I am in charge tonight. I'm the manager. There's no one else here to complain to. Like I said, the owner doesn't come around. You're wasting your time." "Is that so?" the woman said quietly, more to herself than to him. "Look," Daniel continued, clearly enjoying his position of power. "I don't know why you keep insisting there's some kind of mistake. We're a 5-star hotel. We don't make errors like this. Maybe you booked somewhere else and got confused. It happens more than you'd think, especially to people who aren't used to places like this." The insult was subtle but unmistakable, and a few nearby guests shifted uncomfortably, sensing the cruelty behind his polished words. The woman in gray did not flinch. She simply studied him for a long moment, the way someone studies a puzzle they already know the answer to. "You're very confident," she said finally, "for someone who doesn't know who he's speaking to." Daniel laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "I don't need to know who you are. I know you don't have a booking, and I know I have 100 other things to do tonight. So please, either wait quietly over there, or find another hotel. Those are your only 2 options." She held his gaze for a moment longer, then turned without another word, and walked back toward the leather chair, where her tea still sat, now growing cold. She sat down slowly, folded her hands in her lap, and looked out at the storm once more. Behind her, she heard Daniel mutter something to a colleague, followed by a short laugh. She did not need to hear the words to know what kind of comment it was. She had heard that tone before, many years ago, in a different lobby, in a different life, when she had been young and unknown and easy to dismiss. She reached for her phone again and typed a second message to Henry. "Not yet. I want to see the whole picture first. There is more happening here than one rude manager." The reply came instantly. "Whenever you're ready, I'll be here." Outside, the storm showed no sign of slowing. Rain streaked violently across the tall windows, and thunder rolled low and constant, like a warning building somewhere in the distance. Inside the lobby, the woman in the gray coat sat perfectly still, watching, waiting, gathering every small detail like pieces of a puzzle she intended to solve before the night was over. She did not know yet exactly how the night would end, but she knew one thing with complete certainty. Daniel Price had no idea who he had just spoken to, and by the time he found out, it would already be far too late for him to take back a single word. The elderly woman with the folder had settled into a chair not far away, still upset, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. The woman in gray rose quietly, walked over, and sat beside her. "I'm sorry about what happened at the desk," she said gently. "That was not right." The elderly woman looked up, surprised by the kindness of a stranger. "Thank you for saying that. I just don't understand how a place like this can treat people this way. My husband and I saved for months to come here for our anniversary." The woman in gray felt something tighten in her chest again, sharper this time. "What is your name?" "Margaret," the elderly woman said. "Margaret Hollis." "Margaret," the woman repeated softly. "I promise you, this will be sorted out tonight. Please don't leave yet." Margaret studied her for a moment, unsure what to make of the promise from a stranger who, from what she had overheard, did not even have a working reservation herself. But there was something in the woman's voice, a quiet certainty that made her nod. "All right," Margaret said. "I'll wait a little longer." The woman in gray gave her a small, reassuring smile, then returned to her own seat, her eyes drifting once more toward Daniel Price, who was now laughing with another staff member near the desk, completely unaware that the night was about to change in ways he could not yet imagine. Thunder cracked loudly outside, rattling the windows, and for just a moment, every light in the lobby flickered at once, casting long shadows across the polished marble floor before steadying again. It felt, to anyone watching closely, like the building itself was holding its breath. A young couple stood near the elevators, arguing quietly about whether to leave and find another hotel. The man kept checking his watch, his frustration growing with every passing minute. His wife tugged at his sleeve, whispering that they should just go, that this trip was supposed to be relaxing, not stressful. Neither of them noticed the woman in gray watching them from across the lobby, memorizing every detail, every small failure of service that added up to something much larger than a single rude employee. Daniel Price, meanwhile, had grown bored of the wet stranger's silence. He leaned toward his colleague at the desk, a heavy-set man named Victor Combs, and spoke just loud enough for a few nearby guests to hear. "Some people really think they can just walk into a place like this without a reservation and demand a room," Daniel said, shaking his head. "It's almost funny. She probably saw the hotel online and thought she'd try her luck." Victor chuckled along, though his eyes flicked nervously toward the woman in gray, as if some instinct told him this was not a situation to laugh about so freely. "Maybe you should just give her a service room or something. Get her out of the lobby. She's kind of ruining the mood." "Absolutely not," Daniel said firmly. "If we start giving away rooms to anyone who complains, we'll never hear the end of it. People need to learn that this hotel has standards." The woman in gray heard every word clearly, though she gave no sign of it. She sat with her hands folded, her eyes fixed on the rain streaking down the windows, her mind working quickly behind a calm exterior. She had built this hotel on a simple idea, an idea she had repeated to every manager she ever hired, that every guest, no matter how they looked or what they carried, deserved to be treated with respect. It seemed that idea had been forgotten somewhere along the way, buried under polished marble and expensive chandeliers. She thought back, briefly, to the early days, to a small roadside inn, with only 12 rooms and a leaking roof, the very first property she had ever owned. She remembered standing behind that tiny front desk herself, greeting every guest personally, remembering their names, their stories, their small requests. She remembered promising herself that no matter how large her company grew, she would never let it become a place where people were judged by their appearance rather than their humanity. Somewhere along the way, in boardrooms and quarterly reports and rapid expansion, that promise had slipped through the cracks. Tonight, standing in her own lobby unrecognized, she was seeing exactly how far it had slipped. A bellhop rushed past her, pushing a cart loaded with luggage, and nearly collided with an incoming guest. He did not stop to apologize, simply mumbled something under his breath and continued on his way. The woman in gray watched him disappear down the hallway, adding one more detail to the growing list forming in her mind. Margaret Hollis, the elderly guest, had fallen into a light doze in her chair, exhaustion finally overtaking her frustration. Her folder of confirmation papers rested on her lap, slowly sliding toward the floor. The woman in gray rose quietly and adjusted the folder so it would not fall, careful not to wake her. As she straightened, she noticed a new commotion near the entrance. A tall man in a dark green uniform, clearly some kind of security officer, was speaking sharply to a young man who appeared to be homeless, gently but firmly guiding him back out into the storm. The young man did not argue. He simply nodded, pulled his thin jacket tighter around his shoulders, and stepped back out into the rain without complaint, as if he had expected nothing less. The woman in gray felt her stomach tighten. She walked quickly to the entrance and pushed open the heavy glass door herself, stepping out into the storm without hesitation. The rain soaked through her coat instantly, but she ignored it, calling out to the young man before he could walk too far. "Wait, please!" He turned, surprised, water already dripping down his face. "Ma'am, you don't need to come out here. I wasn't trying to cause trouble. I was just looking for somewhere dry to sit for a few minutes." "I know," she said. "Please, come back inside. Sit in the lobby. No one will bother you." The young man hesitated, glancing nervously toward the security officer still standing near the door. "I don't think they'll allow that." "They will," the woman said, her voice carrying a quiet authority that made the young man pause and look at her more closely. "Trust me." She guided him back through the doors, past the startled security officer, who opened his mouth to object, but found himself unable to form the words under her steady gaze. She led the young man to a chair near Margaret's, then went to fetch him a towel from a nearby linen cart, handing it to him, without a word of judgment. "Thank you," he said quietly, wrapping the towel around his shoulders. "Most people just walk past." "Not everyone," she replied. "What's your name?" "Caleb," he said. "Caleb Whitfield." "Well, Caleb, you're welcome to stay right here as long as you need." She returned to her own seat, now soaked through completely, her gray coat clinging to her shoulders, her hair dripping steadily onto the marble floor. Daniel Price, watching from the front desk, finally noticed the exchange and stormed over, his face flushed with irritation. "Excuse me," he said sharply, addressing the woman in gray. "You cannot just invite random people off the street into our lobby. This is a 5-star establishment, not a shelter." "He is a person standing in the rain," the woman said calmly. "That should be reason enough." "It's a liability issue," Daniel snapped. "I'm going to have to ask him to leave, and honestly, I'm growing tired of asking you to keep to yourself while you wait. If you keep causing scenes, I will have security escort you out as well." A hush fell over the small crowd of guests, still lingering nearby. Grace Bennett, passing by with a tray of clean glasses, froze mid-step, her eyes wide with disbelief at what she had just heard. Victor Combs shifted uncomfortably behind the desk, suddenly very interested in a stack of papers in front of him. The woman in gray rose slowly to her feet, standing at her full height for the first time since entering the hotel. Something in her posture had changed, something quiet but unmistakably powerful, though her voice remained perfectly calm. "You would have security escort me out," she repeated, "for asking a wet stranger to sit in a warm lobby." "Yes," Daniel said, though his voice wavered slightly under the weight of her gaze. "This hotel has standards to maintain, and frankly, you've been nothing but trouble since you walked in without a reservation." "I see," she said softly. "Tell me, Daniel, how long have you worked here?" He blinked, thrown off by the sudden question, and by the fact that she knew his name from the small tag on his shirt. "Almost 2 years. Why does that matter?" "No particular reason," she said. "I'm simply curious how someone learns to speak to guests this way in only 2 years." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I speak to guests the way the situation requires, and right now, the situation requires you to either check your temporary excitement or leave." Caleb, still wrapped in his towel, watched the exchange with wide, uncertain eyes, clearly wishing he could disappear into the chair beneath him. Margaret stirred slightly in her sleep, but did not wake. The rain outside seemed to grow louder, drumming steadily against the windows, as if urging the confrontation forward. The woman in gray took a small step closer to the desk, her voice dropping just slightly, though every word remained perfectly clear.
You keep telling me to find the owner if I have a problem. You've said it 3 times now. Are you certain that's the advice you want to keep giving?
Daniel let out a short, humorless laugh, though something flickered uneasily behind his eyes. Yes, actually, I am certain. Go ahead. Find her. See how far that gets you tonight. Careful what you wish for, the woman said quietly. She reached into her wet bag and pulled out her phone once more, her thumb moving quickly across the screen. Daniel watched her, arms crossed, clearly assuming she was calling a friend, or perhaps a taxi to take her to another hotel, finally giving up on her strange, stubborn insistence. He had no idea that the message she was sending would set in motion a chain of events that, within the hour, would completely upend everything he believed about his position, his power, and the woman he had spent the last 30 minutes humiliating in front of a lobby full of witnesses. The message was short. It read simply, "Henry, come in now. Bring the master key and the district director. It's time." Outside, a black car parked near the entrance flashed its headlights once, twice, and a tall figure stepped out into the storm, moving quickly toward the glass doors of the Marsh Grand Hotel. The man's name was Henry Doyle, and he had worked at Elena Marsh's side for almost 15 years, long before the company owned a single 5-star property. He pushed through the doors, shaking rain from his coat, his eyes scanning the lobby, until they landed on the soaked woman standing near the front desk. He did not rush toward her. Instead, he walked calmly, the way he always did, as if nothing in the world could shake him. Daniel Price noticed the newcomer immediately, sizing him up with the same dismissive glance he had given the woman in gray nearly an hour earlier. "Sir, if you're here for a room, I'll need you to wait in line like everyone else." Henry ignored him completely, walking straight past the desk toward Elena. "I got your message," he said quietly. "David is 15 minutes out. He was at a dinner across town." "That's fine," Elena replied, just as quietly. "We have time." Daniel's eyes narrowed with confusion, though a small, uneasy feeling had begun to settle somewhere in his chest, a feeling he could not yet explain, but could not ignore either. "Excuse me, do you two know each other?" "We do," Henry said simply, turning to face him for the first time. "Very well, in fact." Before Daniel could respond, Elena spoke again, her voice calm but distant, as though her mind had drifted somewhere far away, back through years of memory. "Do you know how this hotel started, Daniel?" Daniel blinked, thrown off balance by the strange question. "I assume someone built it. I don't really see how that's relevant right now." "It's very relevant," Elena said. 22 years ago, there was a small inn on the edge of a quiet town, 12 rooms, a leaking roof, and barely enough money to keep the lights on. The woman who owned it worked every single job herself. She cleaned the rooms, she cooked breakfast. She carried luggage for guests who could barely afford to stay there, because she remembered what it felt like to have nowhere warm to sleep. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, unsure why she was telling him this, but something about her tone kept him from interrupting. "She made a promise to herself," Elena continued, "that no matter how big her company became, she would never let a single guest feel unwelcome in one of her properties. She built that inn into 3 inns, then into a small chain of hotels, and eventually into this building, and dozens of others across the country. But through all of it, she never forgot that first cold night, when she herself had nowhere to sleep, and a stranger let her stay in a storage room for free, simply because it was the right thing to do." Grace Bennett, still standing nearby with her tray forgotten in her hands, listened closely, something clicking slowly into place behind her eyes. Victor Combs had gone very still behind the desk, his earlier smugness completely drained from his face. "That's a nice story," Daniel said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence, "but I still don't understand what it has to do with tonight." "You will," Elena said simply. Henry glanced toward the entrance, then back to Elena. David just pulled in. Moments later, the glass doors opened again, and a well-dressed man in his 50s stepped inside, shaking an umbrella before folding it closed. His name was David Ferris, and he served as the district director overseeing 12 properties in the region, including the Marsh Grand Hotel. He spotted Elena immediately and walked briskly toward her, his expression a careful mixture of concern and confusion. Elena, I got Henry's call, David said, lowering his voice as he approached. What's happened? Is everything all right? At the sound of her name, spoken clearly and without hesitation, the color drained slowly from Daniel Price's face. He stared at David, then at Henry, then finally back at the wet, unremarkable woman he had spent the last hour insulting in front of a lobby full of guests. Elena, he repeated, the word barely more than a whisper. As in, Elena Marsh? Yes, Elena said, turning to face him fully now, her eyes steady and unblinking. The owner you've been telling me to go find, several times this evening, if I recall correctly. Victor Combs made a small, strangled sound behind the desk, and quickly busied himself with a stack of papers, though his hands were visibly trembling. Grace Bennett's tray tilted slightly in her grip, glasses clinking together as she struggled to steady herself, her mind racing back through every polite, kind moment she had shared with the stranger, relief and disbelief mixing together in her chest. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again, no words coming to him. His mind raced backward through the last hour, replaying every sharp comment, every dismissive glance, every insult he had thrown so freely at the woman standing before him, the same woman whose name was printed on his paycheck every 2 weeks. I didn't know, he stammered finally. You didn't say anything. You didn't tell me who you were. No, Elena said calmly. I didn't. I wanted to see how you treated someone you believed had no power over you. That tells me far more about a person than how they behave when they know they're being watched. David Ferris looked between Elena and Daniel, quickly piecing together the situation from the tension crackling in the air. Elena, I am so sorry. Whatever has happened tonight, I promise we will address it immediately. I know you will, Elena said, though her eyes never left Daniel's face. Because I intend to make sure of it personally. Margaret Hollis, roused from her light sleep by the sudden commotion, sat up slowly in her chair, blinking in confusion at the small crowd now gathered near the front desk. Caleb, still wrapped in his borrowed towel, watched everything unfold with wide, astonished eyes, hardly daring to move. Elena turned toward the small audience that had gathered, her voice carrying clearly across the lobby, calm but firm enough that every word landed with weight. I want everyone here to know something. This hotel was built on a simple idea, that every person who walks through these doors deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of how they look, what they're wearing, or what kind of first impression they make. Tonight, I watched that idea be forgotten, over and over again, by people I trusted to protect it. She turned back to Daniel, whose face had gone pale, sweat beginning to bead along his hairline despite the cool air of the lobby. You told an elderly guest to find a motel down the street, Elena continued, after she had already paid for her room. You told a young man to leave a warm lobby and stand in a storm because his presence made you uncomfortable. And you told me, more than once, to go find the owner, as though the owner were some distant, powerless figure who would never actually appear. Elena, please, Daniel said, his voice cracking slightly, all his earlier arrogance replaced by something close to panic. I made a mistake. I didn't know it was you. If I had known. That's exactly the problem, Elena interrupted, her voice sharp for the first time that night. You shouldn't need to know who I am to treat me, or anyone else, with basic respect. The moment you decide someone's worth is based on how wealthy or important they appear to be, you've already failed the one job I ask every single employee to do. The lobby had gone almost completely silent, save for the steady drumming of rain against the windows and the distant rumble of thunder rolling further away into the night. Every eye in the room was fixed on the quiet, powerful exchange unfolding at the front desk, none of them daring to look away. David Ferris cleared his throat gently. Elena, how would you like to proceed? Elena took a slow breath, her eyes drifting briefly toward Margaret, then toward Caleb, then finally settling back on Daniel, who stood frozen, awaiting her decision like a man standing before a judge. Tonight, she said finally, we are going to make things right for every guest who was treated poorly in this lobby. Tomorrow, we are going to have a much longer conversation about what happens next. She turned to Henry. Please see that Margaret Hollis is given the finest suite available, free of charge, along with dinner and anything else she needs for the remainder of her stay. Of course, Henry said, already moving toward Margaret's chair. And Caleb, Elena continued, turning toward the young man still wrapped in his towel. "You're welcome to stay here tonight as well, in a proper room, with a hot meal, for as long as you need." Caleb stared at her, speechless, tears welling unexpectedly in his eyes. Thank you. I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," Elena said gently. She turned finally to Grace, who stood nervously nearby, still holding her tray. "You were the only person tonight who treated me with kindness, before you had any idea who I was. That matters more than you know." Grace's cheeks flushed, a small, grateful smile breaking through her nervousness. "Thank you, Miss Marsh. I was only doing what felt right." "That," Elena said, "is exactly the point." Daniel stood frozen throughout the entire exchange, watching his own night collapse around him in slow, humiliating detail. He had walked into his shift hours earlier believing himself untouchable, confident in a position he had never once imagined could be threatened. Now, standing before the very woman whose name was stitched into the fabric of the hotel itself, he understood, far too late, exactly how wrong he had been. "What happens to me?" he asked quietly, his voice barely audible above the fading storm outside. Elena studied him for a long moment before answering. "That depends on what we find, when we look a little closer at how you've been running things around here. Tonight was not the first time, was it, Daniel?" Daniel said nothing, but the guilt written plainly across his face was answer enough. "I thought so," Elena said quietly. "Get some rest tonight. We will talk again tomorrow, and I suggest you use the time between now and then to think very carefully about the kind of person you want to be." As Daniel walked slowly away from the desk, his shoulders slumped and his earlier arrogance nowhere to be found, Elena turned back toward the tall windows, watching the last of the storm drift away into the night sky. She had come to the hotel expecting to find small problems, minor issues in customer service that needed correcting. What she had found instead was something far deeper, a crack running through the very foundation of the values she had spent her entire life building, and she knew, standing there in her soaked gray coat, that fixing it would take far more than one difficult conversation in a rain-soaked lobby. By 7 the next morning, Elena had already changed into dry clothes and was sitting in a small private office on the hotel's 3rd floor, a cup of black coffee cooling untouched beside a stack of printed reports. Henry sat across from her, scrolling through a tablet, while David Ferris paced slowly near the window, his phone pressed to his ear as he canceled his morning meetings one by one. "I want everything," Elena said, without looking up from the reports in front of her. "Booking records for the last 6 months, staff schedules, guest complaint logs, especially anything that may have been closed without proper review, and financial statements, going back at least a year." "I've already requested all of it," Henry said. "Should have full access within the hour, though I have to say, some of what I've already seen doesn't look right." Elena finally looked up. "Show me." Henry turned his tablet toward her, revealing a spreadsheet filled with vendor names and payment amounts. "This is odd. There's a linen supply company that's been billing the hotel nearly triple the normal market rate for the last 8 months. And look at this one, a maintenance contractor that gets paid monthly, but there's almost no record of any actual maintenance work being logged." Elena studied the numbers carefully, her expression unreadable. "Who approves these payments?" Henry hesitated before answering. "Daniel Price. As front desk and operations manager, he has approval authority for vendor payments under a certain threshold, meant to keep small expenses moving without needing to go through corporate every time." "And no one reviews these approvals afterward?" "Normally, yes," David said, finally ending his call and joining them at the table. "But this property has been operating with a reduced regional oversight team for the past year, due to budget cuts I approved myself. I take responsibility for that gap." Elena set down the report, rubbing her temple slowly. "So for 8 months, Daniel has had almost unchecked authority to approve payments to vendors, with no meaningful oversight." "It appears that way," Henry confirmed. "Pull the vendor registration for that linen company," Elena said. "I want to know who owns it." Henry typed quickly, searching through a business registry database. A few minutes later, his eyebrows rose sharply. "This is interesting. The registered owner of the linen supply company is a woman named Patricia Combs." "Combs," Elena repeated slowly. "As in Victor Combs, the front desk clerk from last night?" "Same last name," Henry confirmed. Could be a coincidence, but given everything else, I doubt it. Elena leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling for a moment as the pieces began to fall into place. So Daniel approves inflated payments to a company owned by a relative of another employee, and that employee happens to work the front desk alongside him every single night. It's starting to look like more than a coincidence, David said grimly. Pull Victor's employment file, Elena said, and Daniel's as well. I want their hire dates, their references, everything. Henry worked quickly, and within minutes, additional documents appeared on the screen. Daniel was hired 23 months ago. Victor started about 2 months after him. Interesting detail, though. Victor's application lists Daniel Price as a personal reference. They knew each other before either of them worked here, Elena said quietly. It certainly looks that way. Elena rose from her chair and walked slowly to the window, looking down at the hotel's front entrance far below, where guests were beginning their morning arrivals and departures, completely unaware of the quiet storm building 3 floors above them. This isn't just about rudeness anymore, is it? No, Henry said carefully. This looks like it could be a deliberate pattern of financial misconduct. If the inflated invoices have been going on for 8 months, we could be looking at tens of thousands of dollars, possibly more once we dig deeper. And the rudeness toward guests, David added slowly, following the thought to its natural conclusion, might not be entirely separate from this. If Daniel has been quietly draining money from the hotel, maybe difficult guests, ones who ask too many questions or demand too much attention, become inconvenient obstacles to a system he's built specifically because it's easy to hide behind chaos and bad reviews. Elena turned back to face them both, her expression hardening with quiet resolve. I want a full financial audit conducted immediately, quietly, without alerting Daniel or Victor. I don't want either of them to know we're looking any closer than a routine review until we have everything we need. I'll bring in an outside auditor today, David said, someone with no connection to this property, to keep everything clean and independent. Good, Elena said. And Henry, I want you to speak with staff individually, starting with people who have worked here the longest. Quietly, I want to know if anyone else has noticed anything unusual, and I want to know if anyone has ever tried to report a concern that was ignored or buried. I'll start with Grace, Henry said. She seems sharp, and she was kind to you last night before she knew who you were. That tells me she's someone worth trusting. Elena nodded slowly. Good instinct. As Henry gathered his tablet and rose to leave, Elena added one more thought, almost to herself. Last night, Daniel told me more than once to go find the owner if I had a problem. He said it like a joke, like the idea of me actually appearing was impossible. She paused, staring out at the gray morning sky beyond the window. I wonder how many other guests he said that to. Guests who never got the chance to prove him wrong. We'll find out, Henry said quietly, before stepping out of the office. Down in the lobby, unaware of the quiet machinery now turning against him 3 floors above, Daniel Price arrived for his shift exactly on time, his uniform pressed, his expression carefully composed after a restless, sleepless night. He greeted Victor at the front desk with a forced smile, glancing nervously toward the elevators every few minutes, half expecting Elena Marsh to appear again at any moment. Any word from upstairs? Victor asked quietly, keeping his voice low. Nothing yet, Daniel muttered. But she's here. Somewhere in the building. I can feel it. Do you think she knows anything about the arrangement? Daniel shot him a sharp, warning glance. Don't talk about that here. Not now. Victor fell silent, though his hands trembled slightly, as he straightened a stack of key cards on the counter. Neither of them noticed Grace Bennett standing near the concierge desk a short distance away, close enough to catch the tail end of their hushed exchange, her sharp eyes narrowing thoughtfully as she quietly filed the strange comment away, unsure yet what it meant, but certain it mattered. By mid-morning, the outside auditor David had promised arrived quietly through a side entrance, carrying a briefcase full of equipment, ready to begin combing through months of financial records without drawing any attention from the staff below. Elena watched from the 3rd-floor window as the woman disappeared into a private office, and for the first time since walking through the hotel's doors the night before, she allowed herself a small, tired breath. The rain had stopped, but she knew, standing there in the quiet morning light, that the storm inside her hotel was only just beginning. Grace Bennett had worked at the Marsh Grand Hotel for just over a year, long enough to know most of the staff by name, but not long enough to feel completely comfortable speaking up when something seemed wrong. When Henry Doyle approached her quietly during her afternoon break and asked if she had a few minutes to talk somewhere private, her stomach immediately tightened with nerves. They sat in a small staff lounge on the second floor, away from the noise of the lobby. Henry closed the door gently behind them and offered her a warm, reassuring smile before sitting down across from her. "You're not in any trouble," he said, noticing her tense posture. "I just want to ask you a few questions, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Grace nodded slowly, though her hands remained folded tightly in her lap. "Is this about last night? About Miss Marsh?" "Partly," Henry said, "but it's about more than that as well. I want to know if you've noticed anything unusual happening here, especially involving Daniel or Victor." Grace hesitated, glancing toward the closed door as if worried someone might be listening. "I don't want to get anyone in trouble if I'm wrong." "You won't be," Henry said gently. "But staying quiet about something that might be wrong could hurt a lot of people, including guests who trust this hotel to treat them fairly." Grace took a slow breath, seeming to steady herself before speaking. "There have been a few things, small at first, but they've been adding up." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "A few months ago, an older gentleman complained that he'd been overcharged for his stay. Daniel told him it was a system error and refunded a small amount, but never actually looked into why the charge was wrong in the first place. I remember thinking that was strange, because the same kind of overcharge happened again a few weeks later, with a different guest." "Did you report that to anyone?" Henry asked. "I mentioned it to Daniel directly," Grace said. "He told me it was a known glitch in the booking system, and that corporate was already aware of it. I believed him at the time. I had no reason not to." "What else?" Henry asked, leaning forward slightly. Grace's fingers twisted together nervously. "There's a maintenance closet on the ground floor, near the loading dock. Daniel and Victor go in there sometimes, together, and they always close the door. I never thought much of it until recently, when I noticed they seem to check on it especially closely, whenever there's a delivery scheduled from a company called Riverside Linens." Henry kept his expression neutral, though internally, the name confirmed exactly what he had suspected. "Do deliveries from that company come often?" "Almost every week," Grace said, which always seemed like a lot, honestly. "We don't use that much linen turnover, compared to some of the other supply deliveries." "Anything else?" Henry asked. Grace hesitated again, longer this time, before finally continuing. "There was a guest a few weeks ago, a young family, who complained that housekeeping never came to their room for 2 full days. When they brought it up at the desk, Daniel became very defensive, almost angry, and told them to lower their voices because they were disturbing other guests. It felt like an overreaction, for something that should have just been a simple apology and quick fix." Henry nodded slowly, jotting a few notes onto his tablet. "Grace, I appreciate you telling me all of this. I know it isn't easy. Is Daniel in trouble?" Grace asked quietly. "There's an investigation happening," Henry said carefully. "I can't say much more than that right now, but I want you to know that speaking honestly with me today was the right thing to do, and it will not come back to hurt you in any way." Grace nodded, though worry still lingered clearly in her eyes. "I just want the hotel to be a place people can trust. That's all I've ever wanted since I started working here." "That's exactly what Miss Marsh wants too," Henry said, offering a small, genuine smile. "More than you might realize." After Grace left the lounge, Henry sat alone for several minutes, reviewing his notes carefully, before making his way back up to the third-floor office, where Elena and the outside auditor, a sharp, quiet woman named Priya Anand, were deep in concentration over a wall of printed spreadsheets. "How did it go?" Elena asked as Henry entered. "Better than I expected, and worse than I hoped," Henry said, setting his tablet down on the table. Grace confirmed frequent deliveries from Riverside Linens, more than the hotel would reasonably need. She also mentioned a maintenance closet near the loading dock that Daniel and Victor seem unusually protective of, and a pattern of overcharges on guest accounts that were quietly refunded without any real investigation into the cause. Priya looked up from her spreadsheets, adjusting her glasses. "That lines up with what I'm finding here. The Riverside Linens invoices are inconsistent in a very specific way. The delivery amounts logged by housekeeping never match the amounts billed. Sometimes the difference is small, But over 8 months, it adds up to a significant sum. How significant? Elena asked. Priya hesitated, then turned her laptop screen toward Elena, revealing a final calculated total. Elena's expression remained carefully composed, though a muscle tightened faintly along her jaw as she studied the number. That's substantially more than I expected, Elena said quietly. And this is only from the linen contract, Priya said. I still need to review the maintenance vendor and 2 other suppliers that show similar irregular billing patterns. My professional opinion, based on what I'm seeing, is that this has been a deliberate, ongoing scheme, not a simple accounting error. Elena closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the weight of what she was hearing. She had known, from the moment she saw the numbers that morning, that something was deeply wrong. But hearing it confirmed with such clarity still landed heavily. I want that maintenance closet inspected, Elena said finally, opening her eyes. Quietly, without drawing attention. Henry, can you arrange that without alerting Daniel or Victor? I can have building security check it tonight, after both of them have finished their shifts, Henry said. I'll say it's a routine safety inspection if anyone asks. Good, Elena said. And Priya, please continue the audit as quickly as you can. I want a complete picture before we take any further action. As the afternoon wore on, the hotel continued its normal rhythm below them. Guests checking in and out, luggage carts rolling across polished floors, the soft hum of conversation filling the lobby. To anyone watching, nothing seemed unusual. But high above, in a quiet office filled with spreadsheets and careful calculations, the true story of what had been happening inside the Marsh Grand Hotel was slowly, methodically coming into focus, piece by piece, number by number, until the picture it revealed was impossible to ignore. Elena stood once more at the window, watching the late afternoon sun break weakly through the clearing clouds. She thought of Margaret Hollis, resting comfortably now in her upgraded suite. She thought of Caleb, given a warm room and a hot meal after being turned away into the storm. And she thought of every guest who had never gotten the chance to have their complaint taken seriously, whose overcharges had been quietly refunded and quickly forgotten, allowing whatever scheme Daniel and Victor had built to continue undisturbed beneath the surface. She was no longer simply investigating a case of poor customer service. She was uncovering something far more calculated, and she intended to follow it all the way to its very end, no matter where that path might lead. Daniel Price noticed the change almost immediately. It started with small things, easy to dismiss individually, but impossible to ignore altogether. A maintenance worker he did not recognize spent nearly 20 minutes near the loading dock that evening, checking locks and hinges on doors that had never needed attention before. Grace Bennett, usually cheerful and talkative during their shared shifts, had grown quiet and careful around him, answering his questions with short, guarded replies. And twice that afternoon, he had seen Henry Doyle walking through the staff hallways with a tablet in hand, speaking quietly with employees, who quickly fell silent whenever Daniel passed by. By early evening, his nerves had stretched to their breaking point. He pulled Victor aside during a rare quiet moment at the desk, guiding him toward the far end of the counter, where their conversation would be harder to overhear. Something's wrong, Daniel said, his voice low and tense. They're asking questions. Henry's been talking to people all day. Victor's face paled slightly. Talking about what? I don't know exactly, Daniel admitted, but I saw a woman I didn't recognize going through paperwork in the office upstairs earlier. And there was someone checking the maintenance closet by the loading dock. That's not normal. Maybe it's just a routine inspection, Victor offered weakly, though his voice lacked any real conviction. After last night, Daniel snapped. After Elena Marsh herself walked through that door, and I had no idea who she was? You really think this is a coincidence? Victor swallowed hard, glancing nervously around the lobby. What do we do? Daniel's jaw tightened as he thought quickly, his mind racing through every possible scenario. The records, the ones on the shared drive, the invoice files from Riverside. We need to clean them up, just in case anyone starts asking specific questions. Clean them up how? Victor asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Delete what we can. Adjust the rest so the numbers make sense on their own. Daniel glanced toward the elevator, his expression tight with barely controlled panic. I still have access to the shared financial folder. If I do it tonight, quietly, No one will know the difference. Daniel, if they're already investigating, deleting files might make things look even worse, Victor said, a note of fear creeping into his voice. It's worse if we do nothing, Daniel hissed. I'm not losing everything over this. Not after everything we've built. Later that night, long after most of the day staff had gone home and the lobby had settled into its quieter evening rhythm, Daniel slipped away from the front desk during a brief lull, making his way toward a small administrative office on the second floor that housed several shared computer terminals used for scheduling and basic record-keeping. He glanced over his shoulder before slipping inside, closing the door softly behind him. He sat down at one of the terminals and logged in quickly, his fingers trembling slightly as he navigated toward the shared financial folder. He began scrolling through file after file, deleting invoices, altering delivery logs, adjusting numbers just enough to blur the pattern that had taken months to build so carefully. What Daniel did not know was that the moment he logged into that particular terminal, a quiet security alert had already been triggered. Henry Doyle, working alongside Priya Anand in the third-floor office, had arranged earlier that day for temporary monitoring software to be installed on every shared administrative computer in the building, a precaution taken specifically in case someone attempted exactly what Daniel was now doing. Henry, Priya said suddenly, her eyes fixed on a small notification blinking on her laptop screen. Someone just accessed the shared financial folder from the second-floor terminal. Files are being deleted right now, in real time. Henry moved quickly to her side, watching as a live log scrolled down the screen, documenting each file Daniel deleted almost as fast as he deleted it. That terminal is assigned to front desk staff access, Henry said grimly. Elena, you need to see this. Elena crossed the room quickly, her eyes narrowing as she studied the screen. He's trying to erase the evidence. It looks that way, Henry confirmed. But because of the monitoring software, every file he deletes is already backed up separately. He's not erasing anything. He's just confirming exactly what we suspected. Elena's expression hardened with quiet resolve. Where is he right now? Second-floor administrative office, Henry said, already moving toward the door. I can have security intercept him immediately. No, Elena said firmly, stopping him with a raised hand. I want to see this myself. Let's go. The three of them moved quickly through the quiet hallways, descending one floor, before making their way toward the administrative office at the end of a narrow corridor. Through the small window in the door, they could see Daniel hunched over the terminal, his shoulders tense, his eyes fixed nervously on the screen as he worked as quickly as possible. Elena paused just outside the door, taking a slow breath before pushing it open without knocking. Daniel spun around instantly, his face draining of color the moment he saw her standing in the doorway, flanked by Henry and Priya. Elena, he stammered, instinctively moving to block the computer screen with his body, though the gesture was useless, far too late to hide anything. I was checking something for tomorrow's schedule. At this hour, Elena said calmly, stepping fully into the room. On a terminal that has nothing to do with scheduling. Daniel's mouth opened, then closed again. No believable excuse forming quickly enough to save him. Henry moved past him, glancing at the screen, confirming what the monitoring log had already shown them. He's deleted 11 files from the Riverside Linens folder in the last 20 minutes, Henry said quietly. All backed up, of course. Daniel's shoulders sagged, the last of his composure crumbling completely. Elena, please, let me explain. I'm listening, Elena said, crossing her arms and studying him with a steady, unreadable gaze. Daniel hesitated, his eyes darting between the three of them, searching desperately for some version of the truth that might soften what was coming. It started small, he finally admitted, his voice shaking. Victor's aunt owns a linen supply company that was struggling. I agreed to route more of our orders through her, at a slightly higher rate, just to help keep her business afloat. It wasn't supposed to become anything more than that. But it did, Elena said quietly. Daniel nodded slowly, shame creeping into his expression for the first time since Elena had met him. The rates kept getting adjusted, Victor kept asking for a little more, and I kept approving it, because by that point, I was already too deep to stop without everything unraveling. And the maintenance contractor, the other suppliers Priya has flagged? Elena asked. Daniel's silence answered the question clearly enough. How much, Daniel? Elena asked, her voice quiet but unyielding. How much have you taken from this hotel? He swallowed hard, staring down at the floor, unable to meet her eyes any longer. I don't know the exact number. I stopped tracking it a while ago, because I didn't want to know. Elena studied him for a long, heavy moment, disappointment and quiet anger mixing together behind her steady expression. You had 2 years to build something honest here, Daniel. Instead, you built something that hurt the very people who trusted you, guests and co-workers alike. I know, Daniel whispered. I know that now. Security will escort you off the property tonight, Elena said finally. You are suspended immediately, pending a full and formal investigation. Depending on what that investigation reveals, this may become a matter for the authorities, not just internal discipline. Daniel's eyes widened with fear, but he did not argue. He simply nodded, his shoulders slumped in complete defeat. The fight finally drained out of him entirely. As Henry escorted Daniel from the small office and down toward the lobby, Elena remained behind for a moment, staring at the computer screen still glowing faintly in the dim room, filled with the quiet, damning record of everything Daniel had tried and failed to erase. There's still Victor, Priya said gently, breaking the silence. Yes, Elena said, straightening slightly, her resolve hardening once more. And there's still the question of how far this really goes. How many other properties might have quietly overlooked problems just like this one? She turned toward the door, her voice steady and certain. Tonight was only the beginning of setting this right. Word of Daniel's sudden departure spread quietly through the hotel by the next morning, whispered between staff members in hallways and break rooms, though no one seemed to know the full story, only that he had left abruptly the night before and had not returned for his scheduled shift. Victor Combs arrived for work that morning with dark circles under his eyes, having barely slept, his hands unsteady as he clocked in at the front desk. He had not heard from Daniel since the night before, and the silence terrified him more than any angry phone call could have. He kept glancing toward the elevators throughout his shift, half expecting Henry Doyle or Elena Marsh to appear at any moment and end his career the same way Daniel's had ended, in sudden, humiliating collapse. He did not have to wait long. Around mid-morning, Henry approached the front desk calmly, his expression giving away nothing. Victor, could you join us upstairs for a few minutes? Miss Marsh would like to speak with you. Victor's stomach dropped, but he nodded, following Henry silently toward the elevator, his mind racing through every possible way this conversation might unfold, none of them favorable. When they reached the third-floor office, Elena was waiting alone, seated calmly behind a small table, a folder resting closed in front of her. Please, sit, she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. Victor lowered himself into the seat slowly, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Is this about Daniel? It's about the last 8 months, Elena said, opening the folder and turning it slightly so Victor could see the documents inside. Specifically, about Riverside Linens, a company registered under your aunt's name, which has been billing this hotel at rates significantly above market value for services that, in many cases, were either exaggerated or never fully delivered. Victor's face went pale, his earlier composure crumbling almost instantly. I can explain. I'd like you to, Elena said evenly. Truthfully, this time. Victor took a shaky breath, his eyes dropping to the table. My aunt's business was struggling. She was going to lose everything, her shop, her savings, all of it. Daniel offered to help by routing more of the hotel's linen orders through her company. I didn't think it would grow into what it became. I swear, it started small. But you knew the invoices were inflated, Elena said. You knew the deliveries didn't always match what was billed. Victor's silence, much like Daniel's the night before, spoke louder than any words could have. I need to know everything, Victor, Elena continued. Every vendor, every arrangement, every dollar you're aware of. Cooperating fully now will matter greatly in how this situation is ultimately resolved for you. Victor's shoulders sagged, and after a long, tense moment, he began to speak, slowly at first, then with increasing detail, describing the full scope of the arrangement he and Daniel had built together. Over the better part of a year, he named 2 additional vendors he suspected were involved in similar schemes, though he claimed he did not know the full details of those arrangements. He described how guest complaints that risked drawing too much attention were often quietly smoothed over with small refunds, specifically to avoid triggering any deeper review that might expose the financial irregularities underneath. Elena listened carefully, occasionally jotting brief notes, her expression calm but unwavering throughout the entire confession. When Victor finally finished, the room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the faint hum of the building around them. "Thank you for being honest," Elena said finally. "It doesn't undo what's been done, but it does matter." "What happens now?" Victor asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're suspended, effective immediately, alongside Daniel," Elena said. "The full audit will continue, and depending on what else it uncovers, this matter will likely be turned over to law enforcement for a formal financial investigation. I would strongly advise you to cooperate fully with whatever comes next." Victor nodded slowly, tears welling in his eyes, though he did not argue or protest. "I really am sorry. I let this go too far, because I was scared of losing my family's business, and somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking about who it might actually hurt." "That's often how these things happen," Elena said quietly, her tone softening slightly, though her resolve remained firm. "Small compromises, one after another, until the person who made them barely recognizes themselves anymore." After Victor was escorted from the building, Elena remained in the quiet office for a long while, staring at the folder now filled with names, numbers, and confessions that painted a far more complete picture than she had imagined possible just 24 hours earlier. Priya Anand entered a short while later, carrying a fresh stack of printed reports. "The audit is nearly complete," Priya said, setting the reports down carefully. "Including the 2 additional vendors Victor mentioned, we're looking at a combined total significantly higher than my initial estimate." Elena studied the final numbers, her expression tightening slightly at the scale of what had been happening beneath her own roof for so long without her knowledge. "Send everything to our legal team today. I want this handled properly, transparently, and quickly." "I'll have it sent within the hour," Priya said. "For what it's worth, this kind of thorough, decisive response is rare. Most companies would have tried to bury something like this quietly, rather than pursue it all the way through." "That's exactly the kind of company I refuse to run," Elena said firmly. "If people can't trust that wrongdoing will be addressed honestly, even when it's uncomfortable, then everything else we claim to stand for means nothing." Later that afternoon, Elena gathered the hotel's remaining senior staff into a private conference room, including Grace Bennett, who had been quietly promoted to a temporary supervisory role overseeing the front desk in the wake of Daniel and Victor's sudden departures. Elena stood at the head of the table, addressing the small group with calm, steady honesty. "I want to be transparent with all of you," she began. "Daniel Price and Victor Combs have been suspended following the discovery of significant financial misconduct involving inflated vendor payments and mishandled guest complaints. This situation is being investigated fully, and additional details will likely become public as that process continues." A murmur rippled through the small gathering, though no one seemed entirely surprised, as if the tension of the past 2 days had already hinted at something serious unfolding behind closed doors. "I also want to acknowledge something important," Elena continued. "This happened, in part, because oversight at this property was reduced over the past year, creating an environment where this kind of behavior could take root and grow largely unnoticed. That is a failure of leadership, and while I did not create that specific gap myself, I am ultimately responsible for ensuring it does not happen again, here or at any of our other properties." Grace, seated near the end of the table, listened carefully, a quiet sense of respect growing steadily within her as she watched Elena take full ownership of the situation, rather than deflecting blame elsewhere. "Starting immediately," Elena continued, "we will be implementing stronger financial oversight procedures across every property in the company, along with a new, confidential system for staff to report concerns directly to corporate leadership, without fear of retaliation. No employee should ever feel that raising a legitimate concern is more dangerous than staying silent." David Ferris, seated near the window, nodded firmly in agreement. "I'll personally oversee the rollout of those new procedures across all 12 properties in the region."
"Thank you, David,"
Elena said, before turning her attention back to the room. "I know the last 2 days have been unsettling for many of you. I want you to know that I see the hard work you do every single day, often without recognition, and I intend to make sure this hotel becomes a place that truly reflects the values it was built on, not just in words, but in action. As the meeting concluded, and staff began filing quietly out of the conference room, Grace lingered behind for a moment, hesitating near the doorway, before finally speaking up. "Miss Marsh," she said softly, "thank you for trusting me with more responsibility these past 2 days. I promise I won't take it lightly." Elena offered her a warm, genuine smile, the first true smile she had allowed herself since walking through the hotel's doors 2 nights earlier. "I have no doubt about that, Grace. Sometimes the right person for a job isn't the one who talks the loudest or seems the most confident. It's the one who does the right thing quietly, even when no one is watching." Grace nodded, a small, proud smile forming on her own face as she turned and walked back toward the lobby, ready to continue the long work of rebuilding trust. One guest, one shift, one honest moment at a time. 2 weeks passed before the legal and financial review reached its full conclusion. Elena spent much of that time splitting her attention between the Marsh Grand Hotel and her company's other properties, determined to ensure the same gaps in oversight had not quietly taken root elsewhere. Priya Anand's final audit confirmed what everyone had already feared, a carefully hidden pattern of inflated invoices and mismanaged funds stretching back nearly a full year, involving not only Riverside Linens but 2 additional vendors Victor had named during his confession. The total amount diverted from the hotel's operating budget was substantial enough that Elena's legal team recommended formally reporting the matter to local financial authorities, rather than resolving it quietly through internal channels alone. Elena agreed without hesitation, despite gentle warnings from a few advisors that involving outside investigators might draw unwanted public attention to the hotel. "I understand the risk," Elena told her legal counsel during a tense afternoon meeting. "But covering this up to protect our reputation would only prove that our reputation was never built on anything real to begin with." The investigation moved forward quietly at first, with financial investigators reviewing documents and conducting interviews away from public view. Daniel Price and Victor Combs both cooperated fully once formal proceedings began, having little choice given the overwhelming evidence already gathered against them. Daniel, in a final meeting with Elena's legal team, admitted that what had started as a small favor for a friend had slowly become something he no longer knew how to stop, each new adjustment easier to justify than the one before it, until the pattern had become impossible to untangle from the rest of his daily decisions. Victor's aunt, the registered owner of Riverside Linens, agreed to repay a portion of the inflated funds as part of a broader settlement, expressing genuine remorse and explaining that she had allowed her financial desperation to override her better judgment when Daniel first proposed the arrangement. Throughout the process, Elena remained closely involved, reviewing updates personally rather than delegating the matter entirely to her legal team. She insisted on being present for several key conversations, not out of a desire for control, but because she felt a responsibility to see the situation through completely, given that it had unfolded under her own company's name. Meanwhile, back at the hotel, life slowly began returning to a new, steadier rhythm. Grace Bennett's temporary supervisory role became permanent, formally announced during a small staff gathering where Elena personally handed her a new name tag reading, "Front Desk Manager." Grace's hands trembled slightly as she accepted it, overwhelmed by a mixture of pride and quiet disbelief. "I never imagined this happening so quickly," Grace admitted to Elena afterward, still holding the name tag carefully, as though afraid it might disappear if she loosened her grip. "You earned it," Elena said simply, not because of anything dramatic, but because of everything ordinary. The way you treated a stranger with kindness, before you had any idea who she was. The way you noticed small details others overlooked. Those are the qualities that make someone trustworthy in a position like this. Under Grace's steady leadership, small but meaningful changes began appearing throughout the hotel almost immediately. New training sessions were introduced, focusing specifically on guest respect and de-escalation, ensuring every staff member understood exactly how to handle difficult situations, without resorting to dismissiveness or unnecessary harshness. A new confidential reporting system was installed, allowing any employee to flag concerns directly to corporate leadership without fear of the complaint being buried or ignored by their immediate supervisor. Margaret Hollis, still enjoying the remainder of her extended complimentary stay, became something of a familiar, welcomed presence in the lobby during those weeks, often sharing tea with Grace during quiet afternoon lulls. She had grown fond of the hotel despite its rocky start, and when her husband eventually joined her for the final days of their long-delayed anniversary trip, the couple requested, and received, a private dinner overlooking the hotel's newly renovated garden terrace, a small gesture of goodwill, personally arranged by Elena herself. Caleb Whitfield, the young man Elena had brought in from the storm that first chaotic night, ended up staying at the hotel for nearly 3 weeks, initially given temporary lodging, while the situation with Daniel and Victor unfolded. During that time, Henry Doyle, impressed by the young man's quiet resilience and surprising aptitude for fixing small mechanical issues around the building, offered him a position on the hotel's maintenance team, a modest but steady job that Caleb accepted with visible, grateful relief. "I never thought a rainy night could change my entire life," Caleb admitted to Grace one afternoon, adjusting a loose hinge on one of the lobby's side doors. "One minute I was being told to leave, and the next, I had somewhere to actually belong." "Sometimes it works out that way," Grace said, smiling as she watched him work. Miss Marsh has a habit of noticing people other people overlook. As the weeks passed, news of the hotel's internal scandal eventually reached a few local news outlets, though Elena's decision to handle the matter with transparency, rather than attempting to hide it, ultimately worked in the company's favor. Instead of painting the hotel as corrupt or poorly managed, several articles instead highlighted Elena's swift, thorough response, praising her willingness to personally investigate the matter and hold those responsible fully accountable, regardless of the potential embarrassment involved. One evening, several weeks after that first stormy night, Elena sat once again in the third-floor office, though this time, the mood in the room felt entirely different, calmer, lighter, filled with a quiet sense of resolution rather than tension. Henry sat across from her, reviewing a final summary report from the ongoing legal proceedings. "The formal charges against Daniel and Victor are moving forward," Henry said. "Their cooperation throughout the investigation is expected to factor favorably into their sentencing, but both will likely face significant financial penalties, along with the obvious end of their careers here." Elena nodded slowly, staring out the window at the hotel's newly lit garden terrace below, its soft lights glowing warmly against the darkening evening sky. "It's a strange thing," she said quietly. "I built this place hoping it would always feel the way it did, in the very beginning. Small, honest, personal. Somewhere along the way, as it grew larger, I think I let myself believe that hiring good managers and setting clear policies would be enough to protect that feeling automatically. It's hard to watch every corner of something this big all at once," Henry said gently. "But you did watch, eventually. And you didn't look away once you saw what needed fixing." Elena allowed herself a small, tired smile. "I suppose that's the best any of us can really do." Outside, the hotel hummed quietly with its usual evening activity, guests arriving and departing, the soft murmur of conversation drifting up from the lobby below. It was, in many small but meaningful ways, beginning to feel once again like the place Elena had always intended it to be, not simply through the punishment of those who had done wrong, but through the quiet, steady work of everyone determined to build something better in its place. With the situation at the Marsh Grand Hotel largely settled, Elena turned her attention toward a much larger question that had been troubling her since the very first night of the investigation. If a single property could hide this kind of misconduct for nearly a year without her knowledge, what might be happening, quietly and unnoticed, at some of her other 11 hotels across the region? She called a meeting with David Ferris and her broader leadership team, gathering them in the company's main headquarters rather than at any individual property, wanting the conversation to reflect a company-wide commitment rather than a reaction limited to one troubled location. "I don't believe Daniel and Victor were uniquely capable of building something like this," Elena said, standing before the small group of regional directors and senior managers. "I believe they simply found a gap, one created by reduced oversight, and exploited it. That means the same gap may exist elsewhere, waiting to be discovered by someone else with far fewer scruples than even they had." A murmur of quiet agreement moved through the room, along with a few uneasy glances exchanged between directors who clearly understood the implication. "Effective immediately," Elena continued, "every property in this company will undergo a full financial and operational review, similar to the one conducted at the Marsh Grand Hotel. I understand this will require significant time and resources, but I consider it essential, not optional. David nodded firmly. I'll coordinate the review schedule personally, prioritizing properties that have operated with reduced oversight over the past year, the same vulnerability we identified here. Thank you, David, Elena said. I also want every property to establish a confidential reporting channel, directly to corporate, completely separate from local management. Employees should never feel that raising a legitimate concern requires trusting the very person who might be the problem. One of the regional directors, a cautious man named Gerald Voss, raised his hand slightly. Miss Marsh, if I may ask, given the sensitivity of what happened here, do you have concerns about how this might affect employee morale across the company? Some staff may feel as though they're suddenly under suspicion. Elena considered the question carefully before responding. I understand that concern, Gerald, and it's a fair one. But I'd rather have honest, temporary discomfort while we strengthen our systems than continue operating under a false sense of security that allows real harm to hide beneath the surface. I intend to communicate clearly with every property that this review exists to protect honest employees just as much as it exists to catch dishonest ones. Gerald nodded slowly, seemingly reassured by her steady, thoughtful response. Over the following month, Elena personally visited several of the company's other properties, something she had not done with this level of consistency in nearly 2 years. Having gradually allowed herself to trust regional directors with day-to-day oversight, while she focused on broader company growth. Walking once again through unfamiliar lobbies, speaking directly with staff and guests, she found herself rediscovering the same instinct that had guided her in the earliest days of her career, a hands-on attentiveness that had somehow faded as her company expanded. At one property in a neighboring city, the review uncovered a smaller, less severe issue. A housekeeping supervisor, quietly accepting occasional cash payments from guests in exchange for room upgrades that were never properly logged or paid through official channels. It was a modest scheme compared to what had unfolded at the Marsh Grand Hotel, but it confirmed Elena's fear that gaps in oversight, however small, tended to attract exactly the kind of quiet exploitation she was determined to root out completely. At another property, the review found nothing troubling at all, only a well-run, tightly managed hotel, led by a manager who had, without any prompting from corporate, already implemented many of the same accountability measures Elena was now rolling out company-wide. She made a point of personally thanking that manager, a soft-spoken woman named Priscilla Adeyemi, during a brief visit. You didn't need me to tell you how to run an honest hotel, Elena said, shaking her hand warmly in the lobby. I wish more of our properties reflected the standard you've already set here. Priscilla smiled modestly. I just try to treat this place the way I'd want to be treated if I were the one checking in tired and soaked from the rain. Elena laughed softly at the unintentional echo of her own experience weeks earlier. That's exactly the standard I'm hoping to build everywhere. Back at the Marsh Grand Hotel, Grace continued settling comfortably into her new role, gradually building a reputation among both staff and regular guests, as fair, attentive, and quick to address problems before they had the chance to grow into anything larger. She implemented a simple daily practice inspired directly by something Elena had told her during those first tense days of the investigation, a short evening check-in where staff could quietly flag any guest concerns from their shift, no matter how minor, ensuring nothing slipped through unnoticed the way it once had under Daniel's careless management. Caleb, now several weeks into his new maintenance position, had begun taking evening classes at a nearby technical college, encouraged by Henry, who had quietly arranged for the hotel to cover a portion of his tuition as part of a small employee development program Elena had recently expanded. I used to think one bad night could ruin everything, Caleb told Grace one afternoon, wiping grease from his hands after fixing a stubborn elevator panel. Now I think maybe one different night can completely change everything instead, if you're lucky enough to meet the right person at the right moment. Grace smiled, glancing toward the front doors, where a new group of guests were just arriving, shaking rain from their umbrellas as they stepped into the warm, welcoming lobby. I think Miss Marsh would say every single night matters, not just the dramatic ones. It's the small, ordinary moments that end up shaping everything else. As the final weeks of the broader company review drew to a close, Elena found herself once again standing in the lobby of the Marsh Grand Hotel late one evening, watching quietly from a distance as Grace greeted a tired-looking family checking in after a long flight, offering them a warm smile, a genuine welcome, and immediate, attentive help with their luggage. It was such a small, unremarkable moment, the kind that likely happened dozens of times every single day, across all 12 of her properties. Yet Elena found herself deeply moved by it, a quiet, steady reassurance that the foundation she had first built so many years ago, in a small 12-room inn with a leaking roof, was not lost after all. It had simply needed, for a little while, someone willing to look closely enough to find it again. 6 months later, the Marsh Grand Hotel looked, on the surface, much the same as it always had, its polished marble floors gleaming beneath warm golden lighting, its tall glass doors welcoming a steady stream of guests from every direction. But beneath that familiar surface, nearly everything about how the hotel operated had quietly transformed, shaped by lessons learned during one unforgettable, storm-soaked night. Grace Bennett stood behind the front desk on a calm Friday evening, now fully settled into her role as manager, greeting a young couple checking in for their honeymoon with the same warm, genuine attentiveness she had once shown a soaked, unremarkable stranger in a gray coat. Beside her, a new employee named Oliver Hastings, hired only a few weeks earlier, watched closely, taking notes on how she handled each small detail, from confirming the couple's dinner reservation to arranging a small welcome gift to be waiting in their room. "You always seem to know exactly what people need before they ask," Oliver said, once the couple had wandered off toward the elevators. "It's not really a secret," Grace said, smiling as she straightened a stack of key cards. "You just have to actually pay attention to the person standing in front of you, instead of deciding ahead of time what kind of person you think they are." Oliver nodded thoughtfully, filing the advice away as one of many small lessons he had already absorbed during his short time working under Grace's steady leadership. Across the lobby, Caleb Whitfield, now a full-time member of the maintenance team and halfway through his first year of technical college courses, adjusted a light fixture near the garden terrace entrance, whistling quietly to himself as guests passed by, occasionally exchanging a friendly nod or a brief, easy conversation with those he had come to know over the months. He no longer thought of the hotel as simply a place he had once been turned away from in the rain. It had become, in every meaningful sense, the first real home he had known in a long time. Margaret Hollis and her husband returned for a brief visit that same week, marking the anniversary of their original stay with a smaller, quieter celebration. Grace greeted them personally at the door, remembering their names instantly, a small gesture that visibly moved Margaret nearly to tears. "I never expected we'd want to come back after how that first night started," Margaret admitted, gently squeezing Grace's hand. "But everything that happened afterward, the way it was handled, the way we were treated once things were made right, it actually made us trust this place more, not less." "That means more to us than you know," Grace said sincerely. Upstairs, in the same third-floor office where so much of the investigation had unfolded months earlier, Elena Marsh sat reviewing a fresh set of quarterly reports from across all 12 of her properties. The numbers told a clear, encouraging story, not just of steady financial health, but of a marked improvement in guest satisfaction scores and employee retention rates across the entire company, changes she credited directly to the broader reforms put in place following that first difficult night at the Marsh Grand Hotel. Henry Doyle entered quietly, setting a final folder on her desk. The last property review just wrapped up. Clean report, no issues found. That completes the full company-wide audit. Elena leaned back in her chair, allowing herself a rare, satisfied breath. "It's strange looking back. If Daniel hadn't spoken to me the way he did that first night, if I had simply been given a room without any trouble, none of this might have come to light for years, maybe not until it had grown into something far more damaging. Sometimes the worst moments end up revealing exactly what needed fixing," Henry said, settling into the chair across from her. "You just happened to be standing in the right lobby, at the right time, willing to actually pay attention instead of walking away." Elena smiled faintly, glancing toward the window, where the evening lights of the city stretched out beyond the glass. "I keep thinking about something Daniel said to me that night, before he knew who I was. He told me to go find the owner, as if the very idea of her actually showing up was some kind of impossible joke." "And yet, here you are," Henry said. 6 months later, 12 honest hotels, and a company that finally lives up to the reputation it always claimed to have. Here I am, Elena agreed quietly. Though I think the real lesson wasn't really about being the owner at all. It was about remembering that anyone standing in front of you, no matter how ordinary they seem, might be carrying more weight, more history, or more quiet power than you could ever guess, just by looking at them. She rose from her desk and walked to the window, looking down at the softly lit entrance of the hotel far below, where a new group of guests were just arriving, laughing together as a doorman, new to the position, but already well trained under the hotel's revised standards, greeted them warmly and helped carry their bags without hesitation. It was such a small, simple scene, yet it captured everything Elena had originally set out to build so many years earlier, back when her company had been nothing more than a single struggling inn with a leaking roof and a promise she had made quietly to herself, that no matter how large things grew, every person who walked through her doors would be treated as though they truly mattered. That promise, tested so severely on one stormy, unforgettable night, had finally been restored, not through punishment alone, but through the patient, steady work of everyone willing to prove, day after day, that respect and honesty were never meant to depend on knowing exactly who someone was before deciding how they deserved to be treated. Elena watched the lobby below for a long moment longer, then turned away from the window, ready to close the folder on this chapter and begin looking, with quiet determination, toward whatever came next.